There are stories the industry wants you to forget, stories that never make it into interviews, that never trend on social media, that never even make it to rumor blogs. I lived one of those stories. I never wanted to tell it, but after everything I've seen, the rooms, the rituals, the voices that don't belong to the people singing, I don't think I can stay silent anymore. This isn't just about Lil Nas X. It's about something much bigger. And if you're still here by the end, you'll understand why I can't sleep at night, why music doesn't sound the same anymore, and why, when I tried to quit working for him, the label told me I was already sacrificed. Time changes places, but sometimes it doesn't erase them. Studio C was one of those places. On the surface, it was just another forgotten building on a block no one cared about anymore, stripped of the glow it once carried. The graffiti on the walls wasn't even artistic, just crude tags, angry scrawls, messages layered on top of each other until they lost meaning. The windows were either shattered or boarded up. The air outside smelled faintly of rust and stagnant rainwater. If you didn't know its history, you'd walk right past. But I knew, I remembered, and that's what made it worse. Back in the 90s, stepping into this studio was like stepping into a beating heart. There was always noise, bass lines bleeding through thin walls, laughter from interns running errands at 3 a.m., the rattle of vending machines when coins dropped, the slam of doors when producers stormed out mid-argument. Energy never left this place. People fought, sang, collapsed, created. Every corner reeked of ambition and desperation, but it was alive. Now, silence. The kind of silence that doesn't just hang in the air. It presses down on you. I could hear my own footsteps crunching against the gravel in the lot, and it made me feel exposed, like something else was listening. The only other sound was the faint buzz of a street lamp that flickered on and off like it had been fighting death for weeks. Every time the light blinked out, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I told myself I didn't come back to find anything. That wasn't the truth. Nobody walks into a graveyard without expecting ghosts. The broken lock on the side door wasn't an accident. It looked deliberate, like someone wanted this place to remain accessible, though no one ever came here anymore. When I pushed the door open, it didn't groan or resist. It swung inward with unsettling ease, like it had been waiting for me. Inside, the smell hit first. Stale wires, mildew, and the faint metallic tang of old equipment corroding. The walls, once padded with expensive acoustic foam, now sagged, peeling like dead bark. A trail of water stains streaked the ceiling, and every step I took sent echoes bouncing too far, like the building had lost its ability to hold sound the way it once did. Studio A looked like a body stripped for parts. The walls were bare, the floor stained with coffee rings and cigarette burns. I remembered who had stood there once, names people worship now, but all that remained was an empty square. Studio B was worse. No consoles, no wiring, nothing but the outline where expensive gear had once been bolted down. It felt surgical, like someone had extracted the organs and left the corpse to rot. But Studio C? It was sealed. The door sat flush against the frame, untouched, uncorrupted. That was impossible. I hesitated in the hallway. My palms were damp, not from fear of what I might find, but from certainty, because I knew in my bones, that the room hadn't forgotten me. When I pushed the door open, it was like stepping through a wormhole. Everything was frozen in time. The mixing board stood intact, its lights off except for one faint red LED blinking like a pulse. The dust hung in the air, catching faint light in lazy swirls. One chair sat crooked, turned just slightly toward the booth, as if whoever had been there had stepped away for only a second. But the details were what broke me. The faint smear on the booth glass, faint enough that I couldn't tell if it was lipstick, sweat, or something worse. The faint static in the air, like the room itself was remembering a sound I couldn't hear yet. The weight in my chest told me that this wasn't an abandoned space. It was a container, a vault. And when my hand touched the board, my body remembered before my mind did. My chest clenched, my heartbeat staggered. Memories don't always replay in images. Sometimes they replay in sensation, in the way your ribs ache, in the weight behind your eyes, in the shiver that climbs your spine without asking. Suddenly, I wasn't standing in an empty room anymore. I was back, and she was there. Aaliyah, headphones half on, lip caught between her teeth like she always did when something felt off. Only this time, it wasn't the song that bothered her. It was the room. She kept tapping her fingers against her thigh as if she was counting something only she could hear. And then she looked at me, through the glass. Her lips moved, no sound carried through, but I read the words. Don't leave. Back then, I didn't get it. I thought she was nervous, maybe spooked by the late hours or the isolation. But in that moment, standing decades later in the same spot, I finally understood. She wasn't afraid of being alone. She was afraid of being unseen. Because something was coming. Something only I was supposed to witness. And I had left her there. I used to brush off the whispers from the interns and engineers. They'd hover outside Studio C too long, muttering fragments that didn't make sense. She said no to it. Jay's not happy. Someone else will take it if she won't. Industry gossip, that's all I thought. Ego battles. Producers promising more than they could deliver. Everyone knew how cutthroat it was. But Aaliyah wasn't like that. She didn't get caught in paranoia. She floated through pressure with an ease that baffled everyone around her. Calm, collected, unshakable. Until she wasn't. That last month, something in her shifted. The sparkle in her laugh dulled. Her voice had weight in it, like she was dragging something invisible every time she sang. And sometimes, when we played back her recordings, I could swear there was another tone under hers. A shadow vocal. A breath that wasn't hers. She heard it too. Late one night, when it was just us and a half-asleep producer, she replayed one vocal line over and over. Her face grew paler each time. Finally, she turned to me and whispered, "It sounds like someone else is copying me." When I asked who, she hesitated. Then she said it. Beyoncé. I laughed then. God, I wish I hadn't. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. She just looked at me and said, "She shows up everywhere now. Doesn't talk, just stares. And when she's close, it doesn't feel like a person. It feels like a hallway. Endless, empty, but with music coming from somewhere down it." That's when she told me about Jay. Not as an artist, not as a mogul, just as Jay. He had brought her here, told her this studio was special. Not just a place to record, but something older, deeper. He showed her the room beneath Studio C, a microphone hanging from the ceiling, not plugged into anything, but humming like it was alive. He told her to sing. Said if she did, she'd never fade. She'd be eternal, immortal in the industry. She said it didn't feel like an opportunity. It felt like a trap. And for the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. She told me Jay didn't get angry. He just said, if you don't want it, someone else is already rehearsing your harmonies. And then he left her there, alone. The floor beneath her glowing with strange marks. The microphone humming with no wires. She ran. 3 days later, she boarded a plane she didn't want to be on. Her last call to me was hollow. They're rushing me. They're telling me it has to happen now. I think it's because I said no. The crash came too neat, too clean. The explanations rolled out like they'd been written before it even happened. And that same week, Beyoncé's new song dropped. Her voice, perfect. Too perfect. Not organic, shaped. Decades later, standing in Studio C again, I finally found the panel she had talked about. Half hidden, a way down. The first time I opened it was the night after she died. A message had been left for me. No sender, no subject. Just a time and a place. When I followed it, Studio C was dark, silent, but not empty. Faint music played through the booth. One of Aaliyah's raw stems, ones no one else should have had. The panel was open. A stairwell descended into silence, padded with insulation like someone wanted to kill all sound. My body shook with every step down. At the bottom, I found it. The room she had described, circular, windowless, a golden microphone suspended like an idol, a black ring carved into the floor, covered with notations I didn't recognize. And then Beyoncé entered. No team, no cameras, just her. She stepped into the ring, closed her eyes, and began to sing. It wasn't mimicry. It wasn't imitation. It was replication. Every note Aaliyah had once sung, Beyoncé delivered flawlessly. Phrasing identical, breaths identical, except for the undertone, because under her voice, another emerged. Aaliyah's. Not harmony, not layering, replacement. And watching silently from the shadows at the top of the stairwell was Jay. Standing at the bottom of that stairwell, I felt something I can only describe as a betrayal of sound itself. Music had always been my refuge. Notes, harmonies, vibrations filling the silence of a world that often felt too heavy. But what I was hearing now wasn't music. It was theft. Beyoncé stood under the golden microphone as if it had been made for her, alone. Her posture was precise, shoulders squared, head tilted at an angle that looked rehearsed, almost ritualistic. She didn't fumble with headphones or ask for playback. She just closed her eyes and began to sing. But the voice that came out of her didn't belong to her. Not fully. At first, I thought it was muscle memory, the kind of mimicry every singer picks up after years of exposure. But the phrasing, the hesitation at the start of each line, the way her breath softened at the end, it wasn't imitation. It was exact. And then I realized something impossible. She was singing a run that had never left the booth. A line that only existed in an unreleased take I had worked on personally with Aaliyah. A recording buried in raw stems that had never touched a radio, never left the safety of the board. And yet, here she was, reproducing it flawlessly. Halfway through, something shifted. The weight in her voice deepened. The timbre softened, carrying a texture that didn't belong to her. It was haunting, fragile, and yet powerful. The exact tone Aaliyah carried, even in her happiest songs. The one that made you ache even as you smiled. It wasn't just Beyoncé singing anymore. It was two voices layered into one. Jay-Z stood at the top of the stairwell, silent. He didn't look proud or surprised. He looked like a man waiting for a download to finish. His presence wasn't encouragement. It was surveillance. His eyes didn't leave her, and when she faltered for half a breath, his head tilted slightly, like a conductor silently correcting a symphony. Her hand trembled as she pressed it against her stomach, steadying herself. And then she finished. The final note lingered, heavy in the room, vibrating against the walls like it wanted to live there forever. When she opened her eyes, something in them had shifted. She was still Beyoncé, but she wasn't. The presence was different. Her smile wasn't for the crowd. It was for herself. And then she said it. She looked directly at me, tilted her head slightly, and spoke a name. Not hers, not mine, but the name Aaliyah used to call me. A private nickname, one no one else had ever known. That was the moment I realized what had happened. A transfer. Not a collaboration, not an influence. A voice, stolen. Back in the present, my body moved before my mind caught up. My feet carried me toward that hidden panel again, the stairwell yawning open like it had been waiting for me to return. My hand brushed against the insulation on the walls, and I swore I could feel vibrations pulsing beneath it, as if the very walls remembered every note sung here. The booth above was heavy with dust and silence, but tucked in the corner, something caught my eye. A reel-to-reel machine. Old, rusted, out of place in a digital world. By 2001, no one was using tape anymore, and yet this machine was still running. A blank reel turned slowly, endlessly, like it had been spinning for decades without ever stopping. When my fingers brushed the metal casing, a memory slammed into me. A night outside, a black SUV. Jay in the driver's seat, Aaliyah in the back, me waiting outside. His voice filtered through the glass, low and calculated. If you don't want it, we've got the next one lined up. At the time, I thought he meant a track, a song, a placement. Now I knew he had been talking about her, about Beyoncé. The reel kept turning, and in the faint scratch of its rotation, I could hear something. A breath, a hum, a voice not present but preserved. Jay had told me once to keep everything. Don't delete stems. Don't cut raw takes. Keep the board live even after the artist stopped singing. I thought it was perfectionism. But now I saw the truth. It wasn't about preservation. It was about preparation. Every microphone, every chord, every channel in this booth, it hadn't just recorded sound. It had captured essence. It was a container, a vessel, and I had helped set it up. When I tried to leave, the door wouldn't budge. Booth doors aren't designed to lock from the inside, but this one had sealed. The reel spun faster. The faint hum grew louder, voices layering, overlapping. Aaliyah, Beyoncé, others I didn't recognize, all whispering the same word, sing. And then I saw him, not in flesh, but clearer than memory. Jay stood behind the machine, holding the reel as if it belonged to him. His lips moved, the words cold, flat, final. Sing. The second time, the voice warped. The third time, it didn't sound like him anymore. It sounded like something older, something wearing his voice like a mask. The lights flickered. The mic above me crackled on. Live, even though no switch had been flipped. The booth filled with 1,000 half-remembered songs woven into a drone that felt less like music and more like a threat. I dropped to my knees, hands over my ears. I didn't say yes, I whispered. I'm not part of this. And just like that, silence. When I opened my eyes, the booth was empty again. The reel gone. The door unlocked, but my hands still shook, dust clinging to my skin like residue from something real. That was when I understood. This place wasn't just a studio. It was a vault. Not for tracks, for voices, for people. And once something was stored here, it never really left. For years, I avoided thinking about that night. Memory blurred at the edges, details slipping away like static dissolving into wind. Sometimes I'd convince myself it hadn't happened, that grief had twisted my perception, that trauma had filled gaps with nightmares. But then the invitations began. They never came with names, just locations, times, always midnight, always empty buildings with histories scrubbed clean. And every time I went, against my better judgment. The first one was Diddy's Black Party. Everyone knew the legends. No photos, no witnesses willing to talk, no repeat events, just silence. But when I received the call, I recognized the pattern. The same way Studio C had summoned me. This was another gathering, another ritual. The mansion loomed like a mirage, glass and steel glowing under the moonlight. Luxury cars lined the driveway, engines still ticking. Inside, the air was heavy, metallic, charged. Celebrities moved like mannequins, their eyes hollow, their smiles stretched too thin. Evan, the friend who brought me, whispered with excitement that this was the kind of party where deals were made, where careers were launched. But I knew better. This wasn't a celebration. It was an offering. The women glided across the floor like shadows wrapped in silk. Beautiful, flawless, but too identical. Their eyes held no warmth, only a faint emptiness that made my stomach twist. When one brushed past me, her hand ice cold, she whispered a single word I almost missed. Help. By midnight, the air had changed. Conversations died. Music slowed. And everyone drifted toward the grand hall like moths to a flame. At the center stood Diddy, dressed in pristine white, but his posture was loose, his eyes glassy, unfocused, his words slurred slightly as he raised a glass. It's time, he said. And I realized the rumors were true. This wasn't a party. It was a ritual. Before anything else happened, Diddy raised his hand. His voice was slurred, but it still carried power, like the words weren't his own but were being pushed through him. A toast, he said, smiling too wide. A special drink for a special night. From the shadows, servers appeared carrying trays of crystal shot glasses. Inside each glass was a liquid that didn't look natural. It shimmered under the chandeliers, its color shifting between deep black and violent purple, as if it were alive, breathing. The guests grabbed them eagerly, their movements synchronized, almost rehearsed. The room's energy shifted. The faint whispers that had been lingering at the edge of my mind grew louder, curling around me like smoke. Evan, standing at my side, picked up a glass without hesitation. His eyes gleamed with the kind of desperate excitement that made me want to shake him. "This is it," he whispered. "This is what makes it all worth it." I stared at the glass that was shoved toward me. My stomach turned. The liquid pulsed faintly, as if it was waiting for me to accept it. "I'm good," I muttered, raising my hand in refusal. The server paused for a moment, their expression blank, unreadable, before moving on. Evan shot me a look, half disbelief, half disappointment. But he didn't argue. He raised the glass and downed it in one quick motion. His face twisted in disgust, but when he opened his eyes again, they looked different. His pupils dilated, his jaw tightened. He wasn't the same. Around us, hundreds of guests lifted their glasses in unison, tilting their heads back. The liquid slid down their throats. And in that instant, the air in the hall shifted. At first, it was subtle, like the room had dropped in pressure, but within seconds, it became suffocating, unbearable, as though the air itself had thickened and was pressing against my lungs. And then the women began to undress. It wasn't sensual. It wasn't playful. It was deliberate, ritualistic. Dresses slipped off shoulders and pooled on the marble floor like molten fabric. Their bare bodies were marked with intricate glowing sigils that pulsed with faint light. The markings weren't tattoos. They moved. They shifted. They breathed. "What the hell is this?" I whispered, but Evan didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the circle forming in the center of the room. The whispers grew louder, no longer just faint suggestions in my ears. They were coming from the walls, the floor, the very air around me. And at the center of it all, Diddy stepped forward, arms wide, his pristine white suit now stained by the dark liquid he spilled carelessly from his glass. "This," he said, his voice booming now, guttural, wrong, "is how we honor the night." The women swayed in unison, their glowing markings pulsing in rhythm. They formed a circle in the middle of the grand hall, their bodies twisting and moving in ways that seemed almost impossible. Too fluid, too synchronized, like marionettes guided by invisible strings. The air crackled. Static buzzed against my skin. And then the chanting began. It started with Diddy. His voice dropped lower, harsh syllables spilling out in a language I didn't recognize but felt deep in my bones. Alien. Wrong. It tore through the silence, sharp and guttural, a sound that felt like it was unraveling me from the inside out. The crowd answered, their cheers rising into grotesque laughter. They weren't just watching, they were participating. Their faces twisted into grotesque parodies of joy, clapping and cheering as if the whole thing were entertainment. I couldn't move. My legs trembled as though the marble floor had fused to my feet. My breath came shallow and my chest tightened as the energy in the room thickened. Diddy grabbed a dark bottle from one of the trays. Its contents glimmered unnaturally, the same way the liquid in the glasses had. He poured it over the women in the circle, letting it run down their glowing markings. They writhed and arched, their movements no longer human, their bodies pulsing with the same rhythm as the floor itself. And then it began. Their bodies intertwined, not in passion, but in chaos, twisting, tangling, convulsing. Their glowing marks flared with each movement. It wasn't for pleasure. It wasn't even for each other. It was for power. The chanting quickened, the rhythm escalating. The chandeliers flickered violently. The walls seemed to breathe. The floor beneath the circle cracked, glowing with molten lines that spread outward in jagged patterns. The energy surged, vibrating through my chest like a war drum. And then Diddy dropped to his knees. Tears streamed down his face, his body shaking, his voice breaking with ecstasy. "You're here," he sobbed, raising his arms high. "You're finally here." At first, I thought it was smoke rising from the cracks in the marble. But it wasn't smoke. It was form, a shape, a presence. It towered above us, shadow stretching across the grand hall. So massive, the chandeliers swayed beneath its weight. Its eyes glowed like coals buried deep in ash, burning into every soul in the room. And then I heard it. Not with my ears, but inside my skull. "I am desire." The words reverberated in my bones, stripping me bare. I am the hunger that drives men to ruin, the flame that consumes all who draw near. I am the king of what lies hidden, the master of lust, the corrupter of flesh and soul. The women collapsed to the floor, trembling, their glowing markings blazing brighter than ever. The crowd erupted in cheers, their hollow faces stretched in twisted awe. And Diddy? He lay prostrate, his forehead pressed against the marble. His voice shook as he cried out, "Everything I've done has been for you. Every ritual, every offering, it's all been for your glory." The figure didn't move its mouth, but the words thundered through all of us. "I am Asmodeus, the king of lust, the prince of desire. Tonight you stand in the presence of true power." The chandeliers shook, the walls quivered. The very air felt like it was collapsing under its weight. And then its eyes swept across the crowd, slowly, judging, measuring, until they landed on me. The temperature around me plummeted. Frost crept across the marble beneath my shoes. My chest seized as if invisible hands were squeezing the life out of me. The whispers in my head grew deafening, all voices merging into one booming command. "Sing." My body locked in place. My throat burned. And in that moment, I realized the truth. This wasn't about music. It never had been. It was about sacrifice. And whether you said yes or no didn't matter. Because once you stepped into this machine, this system, they had already claimed you. The conference room was larger than my first apartment. Frosted glass walls, a table long enough to seat 20. Leather chairs that creaked in unison when people sat. The air conditioning hummed. Too cold. The kind of cold that doesn't refresh, but empties you out, like standing inside a refrigerator. Executives filed in with perfect posture, every move calculated. Their suits were dark, their smiles polite but shallow. They spoke in clipped sentences, words stripped down to utility, metrics, placements, impressions, rollouts. I recognized the cadence. The same cadence I'd heard in Studio C when Jay gave instructions that weren't really instructions. They were preparations. At the head of the table sat a man I'd never seen before, though everyone else acted like he'd been there all along. No one introduced him. He didn't offer a handshake. He just leaned back, fingers steepled, his eyes drifting across the room like he already knew what each of us was going to say. The star, is ready," he said finally. His voice was smooth, but something about it didn't belong to him. It felt like the sound was being pushed through his throat from somewhere else. "But before we proceed, we need to confirm commitment." The word commitment landed like a blade on the table. Everyone nodded. No one asked what it meant. One of the assistants slid a folder in front of me. Glossy pages, tour dates, sponsorship deals, promo campaigns, all the surface level glamour. But between the pages, tucked like an afterthought, was a single sheet of paper. Blank, except for one line typed dead center. "Already sacrificed." My breath caught. I looked up. The man at the head of the table was watching me now. His eyes were steady, unblinking. "You understand your role," he said. It wasn't a question. Something in me broke. "I want out," I whispered before I even realized I'd spoken. The room went silent. Chairs stopped shifting. The hum of the AC cut out like someone had flipped a switch. All I could hear was my own breathing. Too loud, ragged. The man leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. He smiled, but it wasn't warm. "You can't quit," he said calmly. "You already belong. The ledger was filled before you ever thought about leaving." I shook my head. "I didn't sign anything." He chuckled. The sound was hollow, rehearsed. "You think paper's how this works? You walked into Studio C. You stood beneath the red light. You heard the hum. That was enough. You don't step into the machine and walk away whole. You're already sacrificed." My chest tightened. My skin prickled with heat and cold at the same time. The faint mark on my sternum pulsed, spreading a dull ache through my ribs. I opened my mouth to argue, but my phone buzzed in my pocket. When I pulled it out, the screen was blank. No caller ID, just a red waveform bouncing gently, like the device was listening, recording. The man nodded toward it. "They're reminding you." I pressed the power button, but the phone didn't turn off. The waveform kept pulsing, steady, hypnotic. Across the table, the executives went back to their scripted chatter like nothing had happened. Numbers, impressions, campaigns. But every few seconds, one of them would glance at me with the same expressionless gaze the women in gold had worn by the SUVs. Not quite human anymore. And that was the moment I realized. The Black Party, Studio C, the real, it wasn't isolated. It was the same machine, different faces, same hunger. And I was inside it, whether I wanted to be or not. In the days that followed, the mark on my chest darkened. At first it looked faint, like lines drawn by a child with a dull pencil. But under certain light, it spread. Thin branches extended outward like veins, pulsing faintly when I stood too close to a speaker or when the Stars' songs came on the radio. The worst part was the dreams. I'd wake drenched in sweat, heart pounding, convinced I had been standing under the golden microphone again. Sometimes I'd hear Aaliyah's voice, fractured and distant, layered beneath someone else's. Sometimes I'd hear the Stars' voice, bending, stretching, twisting into something it wasn't meant to be. But always the same word pressed against my skull when I woke. Sing. Everywhere I went, reminders followed. Billboards, streaming ads, magazine covers. Faces of artists smiling too perfectly, eyes just a little too empty. I couldn't look at them without wondering if they had stood where I stood, if they had heard the hum, if their voices were theirs at all. I tried to avoid music, but it didn't matter. It found me, in stores, on TV, blasting from cars at stoplights. And every time, beneath the glossy production and polished beats, I swore I heard something else. A faint undertone, like a voice not fully erased, a ghost track bleeding through. The machine was everywhere. And the mark on my chest reminded me, and it wasn't outside it. I was fuel. One night, I caught my reflection in the mirror and didn't recognize myself. My eyes were ringed with dark circles, but it wasn't just exhaustion. My pupils dilated when no light changed. My breath misted, even though the room was warm. And for one horrifying moment, my reflection moved a fraction slower than I did. The machine wasn't just outside anymore. It was inside me. They said it was just a sound check. That's what they always say. I walked into the rehearsal hall expecting the usual chaos. Technicians running cables, dancers stretching in mirrors, assistants juggling schedules. On the surface, it looked exactly like that. Stage lights half-powered, smoke machines hissing, giant LED panels buzzing. But the air told a different story. It was thick, metallic, and the same taste I remembered from Studio C, from the Black Party, from the driveway lined with women in gold. My tongue tingled with it. My chest ached with it. And then he walked out, the star. Dressed casually, sweat, sneakers, hoodie up. But there was nothing casual about his presence. The room shifted around him like gravity bent slightly toward his body. His laugh was light, his movements loose, but the silence that followed every word was too heavy, too rehearsed. Everyone in the room watched him with a reverence I couldn't name. The producer clapped his hands. Let's run it. The star grabbed the mic. It wasn't golden, not like the one beneath Studio C, but it carried the same weight, the same hum. When he sang, I froze. It wasn't his voice, not fully. I'd heard this trick before. A double layer, a ghost vocal riding beneath his tone. A second voice, faint but distinct, harmonizing in real time. Not sampled, not engineered. Something alive. The dancers didn't notice. The crew didn't flinch. But I heard it, clear as day. A timbre that wasn't his, woven under every line like an imprint burned into the sound itself. I felt the mark on my chest pulse, hot and cold at once. My knees buckled, and I pressed a hand against the wall to steady myself. The star glanced at me mid-note, just for a second, and his smile stretched a little too wide. Later, in the green room, the assistant handed me a folder. Thick, heavy paper. A contract, maybe. But inside, it wasn't numbers or schedules. It was names. Pages of them. Artists I knew. Artists I admired. Artists who had vanished after one hit. Each name was paired with a symbol I recognized. The same notations carved into the floor beneath the golden microphone. The same lines now etched into my skin. And then I saw my own name. Already crossed out. Already marked. Already cataloged. At the bottom of the page, scrawled in red ink, already sacrificed. My throat dried. My hands shook. I slammed the folder shut, but the words stayed burned in my head. I looked at the assistant. He didn't blink. He just said, "The machine doesn't need your permission." It only needs your presence. And I understood. It wasn't about who signed contracts. It wasn't about who said yes or no. It was about proximity, about being close enough to the hum, to the real, to the rituals. Once you stepped inside, you were already cataloged, already processed, and already sacrificed. That night, the star went on stage. Tens of thousands of fans screamed, the stadium vibrating with the weight of their voices. Lights strobed, smoke billowed, cameras rolled. But behind the spectacle, I felt the hum. The same hum from Studio C, from the Black Party, from the driveway. It vibrated through the steel beams of the stage, through the wires, through my chest. When he sang, I heard it again. The ghost voice, layered under his own. Sometimes faint, sometimes stronger, sometimes pushing forward like it was trying to take over. The crowd didn't notice. They cheered louder, fed by something they couldn't name. Their joy wasn't entirely their own. Midway through the set, the lights cut to black. For a full 5 seconds, silence swallowed the stadium. When they came back, the star stood alone under a single spotlight. No dancers, no band, just him and the mic. And then he sang a note that wasn't his. I don't mean it didn't sound like him. I mean it literally wasn't him. It was someone else's voice, someone I knew, someone long gone. Aaliyah's tone bent through his throat. The crowd roared, oblivious. But I staggered backward, bile rising in my throat. This was the machine at work. Not homage, not inspiration. Theft. Transfer. Continuation. And I finally understood what the man in the office had meant. You can't quit. You can't walk away. Because once the machine has you, your voice, your presence, your memory, it doesn't matter if you live or die. You've already been sacrificed. The show ended the way they always do. Confetti cannons, fireworks, lights so bright you can't tell which direction is up. The crowd screamed, drunk on the sound of a voice that wasn't wholly the stars anymore. They left believing they had witnessed genius, but I left knowing I had witnessed a ritual. Backstage was chaos. Assistants sprinting, managers shouting, sponsors flashing smiles with dead eyes. The star sat in a folding chair, sweat pouring down his face. He wasn't panting, he wasn't tired. He was smiling, calm, almost serene, as though he had just returned from a place the rest of us couldn't see. When he caught me staring, his grin widened. He raised his hand and pointed at my chest. I froze. The mark. It pulsed under my shirt, a dull heat radiating outward. I didn't move, didn't breathe. And then he whispered it, just loud enough for me to hear over the din. Already sacrificed. Nobody else reacted. Nobody else even seemed to notice. I stumbled out into the hallway, dizzy, my body buzzing like an old amplifier about to short. My reflection in the exit sign's glass panel looked delayed again, moving a fraction of a second after me. My reflection's mouth hung open, whispering words I couldn't hear. I didn't go home. I drove without thinking, streets blurring, until I found myself outside another building I swore I'd never return to. A studio, not Studio C. Another one. New name on the sign, new paint on the doors, but I recognized the bones. These places all felt the same once you knew what to look for. The lock gave way too easily, as if it wanted me in. Inside, the hallways stretched wrong, longer than they should be, lined with doors that hummed faintly, each one radiating a different frequency. I pressed my hand against the nearest one. The vibration slid up my arm like static. Every room contained a piece of it. The machine. Not gears, not wires, but the same golden microphones suspended in silence, the same black circles carved into the floors, the same notations etched into concrete. Each booth was a vault. Each booth was a container. And each booth was already full. I heard voices layered into the walls, fragments of songs, laughter, screams, notes that didn't belong to anyone living. They weren't stored. They were trapped. When I touched the glass, my chest seared. The mark flared so hot I dropped to my knees. My ears rang with 1,000 whispers crashing into one. Sing, sing, sing. I pressed my palms to the floor, trying to ground myself. That's when I saw it. The sigils glowing faintly beneath my skin, spreading outward from the mark on my sternum. Not just ink, not just scars. Notes, measures. A score written into me, waiting to be performed. I wasn't just a witness. I was an instrument. Days blurred. I stopped eating, stopped sleeping. Everywhere I went, the hum followed. The buzz of street lamps, the drone of engines, the static between stations on the radio. It all carried the same undertone, the same demand. My reflection grew worse. Sometimes it mouthed along to songs I wasn't singing. Sometimes it pressed its palm against the glass, fingers splayed, as though begging me to trade places. And the mark kept spreading. By the second week, it wrapped around my ribs like vines, glowing faintly under my skin when I passed by speakers. I tried covering it with clothes, but the heat burned through fabric. People on the street would glance at me and quickly look away, like their eyes had brushed against something they couldn't acknowledge. I knew where this was heading. I'd seen it before. In her eyes, in the women lined outside the mansion, in the star's voice bending into something not his own. The machine doesn't ask, it consumes, and now it wanted me to decide. Not whether to join, that part was already decided, but whether I would resist until I was erased, or step forward and sing, letting the machine use me the way it had used everyone before me. My hands shook as I touched my chest. The hum vibrated louder, urgent now, like a song stuck on its final bar, waiting to resolve. I closed my eyes, and for the first time, I whispered back. I didn't say yes. The hum shuddered. The mark burned, and the whispers roared in unison, furious now, the command thundering through me until my knees hit the floor. Sing.